the regular presentation mode and not the like presenter view with the double slides?
Yeah, yes, it's ready
Okay.
to go. Yes.
All right, sounds great. And thanks for shouting out to Jerry Thompson there. Hey, Jerry. Just as a quick aside, when I was interviewing for this position, I called Jerry up, and we had known each other obviously from my time at Auburn. And he mentioned these lunch series and said that y'all do a really great job with them, and that he was typically in attendance if he could be, and that y'all had done a good job putting these together throughout COVID. And so he's like, if you get this job, make sure you get hooked up with these people. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm glad for that connection with Jerry and to just be here with you all. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk about nutritional management during different calving seasons. And so I'll first define those calving seasons and what they look like for the state of Tennessee. And then I just want to answer kind of a couple of questions throughout my presentation. How do cow needs change with stage of production? And so that are different stages of production. And then how does the weather influence cattle needs? How does nutrition affect rebreeding? And then what about grass tetany? And I know that Gary mentioned grass tetany a little bit the other day, so I just wanted to follow up on that since it is an important time of the year to be thinking about it. So I'll get on the Justin Reinhardt soapbox for just a minute. A defined calving season is really important for people who want to market their cattle in larger lots. It results in a more uniform calf crop. So we have calves that were born in a smaller window of time rather than, throughout the year. So they're all comparable in age and weight usually. This leads us to more marketing options. So again, we're able to market those in larger lots, maybe even truckloads if we have a larger herd, rather than selling them off, one at a time, if that works for you. Now, there are certain, if you're trying to produce freezer beef throughout the year, you may not have a calving season that is as tightly defined. But in general terms, we want to think about having a calving season that's fairly short. And so from a nutritional standpoint, that allows us to target the herd's nutritional and health needs more precisely. That way, if we have, all of our calves or all of our cows have calved out within the first, the same month or so, we're able to manage their nutrition more precisely because we're not trying to meet the needs of lactating cows and the needs of dry cows. And so we can really start to be precise in the way that we feed our cattle. So with that being said, a defined calving season is important, but some people have different seasons of calving in that they may calve in the fall, the winter, or the spring. And so there are different reasons for that. A big one is forage availability or their nutrition program and the way that they choose to manage their cattle. So they may choose to calve in the fall and then feed cattle throughout the winter with hay and supplement, or they may choose to calve in the spring and rely more on grazed forages. And so we'll break that down a little bit and what that looks like for the state of Tennessee. And then, of course, market activity plays into what our calving season is. There are some opportunities to market calves at different times of the year that may be more profitable, but of course, there are a lot of factors that come into play when you have to determine what calving season works best for you. So just for the purpose of this presentation, I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page about what the calving seasons are in terms of months. This table came out of a publication from UT Extension. Andrew Griffith and a couple of folks worked on profitability of the different breeding and calving seasons. And so focusing on this middle column here, calving months, when I'm talking about spring calving for this presentation, I'm talking about generally the months of February and March calving. Fall calving, we're focused on September and October, and then winter calving, December and January. And I'm mainly going to highlight the fall and spring and kind of contrast and compare what those look like. But these are just the general months that we're going to follow for these different calving seasons. So I'm a visual person. I really like to see things in figures or graphs. And so when I was thinking about putting this presentation together, I wanted to overlay what that calving season looked like kind of on top of what the nutrition programs look like that are available to us here in Tennessee. And so we have the fall calving schedule here. It starts in the months of September, so it starts with calving. And then there are some stages of production: calving, peak lactation, the time that we want to rebreed, and the time that we want to wean calves. And then I just have some different options here as far as nutritional management goes. So the active growing season of fescue, the stockpile season, if you have cool season annuals, and then the use of hay and supplementation. And it's important to know that these are not solid, hard lines for this presentation or this graph. I had to obviously cut them off that way, but these do kind of run over into each other. So there's a little bit of crossover here. But I wanted to focus on each of these stages of production and what the nutritional management might look like for those. So in a fall calving herd, we're calving in September and October generally. And at that point, we've probably got some stockpiled fescue that's growing, but we may not be grazing on it yet. But that's just kind of the time frame that we would think about stockpiled fescue. It's really not actively growing, and maybe it's not ready just yet to graze. And then we move into that peak lactation period, 2 to 3 months after calving. And so for fall calving, that would be November, December, and January. And then we're also asking those cows to breed back during that same time. So when their energy requirements are the highest, we're also asking them not only to provide milk for their calf, but also to breed back. And so that's really the point where we're going to need to meet those high energy demands. And for Tennessee, that can be done using stockpile. Maybe we've stretched that stockpile out with some hay or some supplement. And so that's where these kind of start to overlap. And those are some options that are available for the peak lactation period. And then if we move into April and May, this is when we're typically going to wean these calves from a fall calving herd. And that's going to overlap with the time that maybe our fescue is starting to green up. If we've planted cool season annuals, we have the opportunity to graze those. And so this is just, like I said, I'm a visual person. This kind of helped me figure out kind of how we can match our system to a fall calving season. And so then if we think about a spring calving season, I have the same figure here, but I've switched the months at the top. So now we're starting in February. And so if we calve in February and March, we see that that lines up in a time when our fescue is not yet actively growing. Our stockpile, maybe we have some stockpile left if we've done a good job managing that or stretching that with hay supplies. Potentially we could get on some cool season annuals pretty quick, depending on how well they established in the weather. And then there's obviously a need for some hay and supplement during that time. But really the advantage of spring calving is we're hitting that peak lactation and that rebreeding period during the time when our forages, our tall fescue, is actively growing. And so things have started to green up. We're able to put lactating cows on there and meet some of those higher energy demands with actively growing forage rather than with hay and supplement. And then, of course, if we have those cool season annuals, we're able to utilize those as well. So thinking about weaning time, we're weaning those calves in September and October. And we may, use some of that active growth, the end of that active growth of fescue. That they've been taking advantage of some of that fescue that's growing over the summer, even before they've weaned. And so this is just where that weaning period lines up for the spring calving herd. So when we think about nutrient requirements for a brood cow, her requirements are going to change throughout her stages of production, but they're not necessarily going to change with the season per se, except for some of the environmental conditions that go along, especially with the winter. And so in terms of energy or total digestible nutrients and crude protein, I've put out the percentages that brood cows need as well as the pounds per day. It's important, when we think about feeding cows, we're not feeding them in percentages, we're feeding them in pounds at the end of the day. So I always like to put those values as well, just so we can be thinking about what that really looks like in terms of amount of feed. But we can see obviously that a dry pregnant cow has the lowest energy and crude protein needs. And then as she gets closer to calving, those energy and protein needs will increase. And we want to make sure that we're providing enough nutrition during that time so that she calves in an adequate body condition, so that she doesn't lose too much condition when she goes into peak lactation. And of course, that peak lactation is going to coincide with the highest energy and crude protein needs. And so thinking about these pounds per day values, I want you to keep this 18 pounds per day in mind. I'm going to have an example in just a few minutes about increased energy needs in cold weather, and we'll kind of refer back to that value. So again, just putting that on a visual format, if you're visual like me and you like to see it in a graph, this is the TDN requirements of a cow based on her stage of production or throughout her yearly production cycle, starting with calving. And then we see that increase in energy and crude protein, or excuse me, in energy in this graph needs. And of course, there's a deficit there. If we're comparing this to the average hay quality that we get or that we produce, there's going to be a need for some additional energy there. And that's just because of her physiological needs. That's not even compounded by weather needs for this particular visual. And so making sure that whether we're fall or spring calving, we're meeting that energy deficit there. And then of course, as we wean that calf, her requirements are going to drop. We may be able to get by with some lower quality hay. And then of course, going back into that cycle of calving again. And so throughout the year, making sure that we're strategically meeting these needs and precisely meeting these needs is going to be important. This figure is crude protein, so the same trend here, maybe not as large of a deficit as crude protein as there is in energy. Typically, our forages tend to be deficient in energy more so than protein. And so I always like to bring up the point that a lot of times protein gets more credit than it deserves. And that's not to say that it's not important, but sometimes we'll hear people say, well, this feed's higher in protein, so it must be better. It must be the one that I need to feed my cows. Or I'm feeding a 16% protein feed. There can't be any problem with my nutrition because I'm feeding protein. But in order for cattle to efficiently use that protein, they have to have energy in their diet. And so energy drives whatever performance or growth we're looking for, and protein then supports that. And so when it comes to supplementation or providing plenty of nutrition to these cattle, we want to make sure that we're taking into account the energy as well as the protein content of the diet. So those were just kind of the baseline needs based on a cow's physiological needs for energy, but also when we think about the winter months, weather really influences energy needs, and that's really been highlighted this past couple of weeks in quite a few states across the Southeast, and so we've seen people having to compensate for that lower temperature and those wet conditions to make sure that cattle are getting the energy that they need. So cattle perform best in what is known as the thermoneutral zone. And this is roughly from 32 to about 77 degrees. And so basically that's just the temperature that, one, they're the most comfortable in, but two, where they're not having to work very hard to regulate their body temperature. So they're not too cold and they're not too hot. So in the winter months, we have to think about the lower critical temperature. And the lower critical temperature is a threshold that below that temperature, the animal's performance will start to decline because they're going to start utilizing more energy to keep their body temperature regulated. So that may mean, we shiver when we get cold and we produce energy that way. But they're going to eventually start drawing from some of their energy stores in their body if they don't have additional energy to make up for that deficiency. So in the wintertime, when we just have cold and windy conditions, if it's not wet, if their hair coat is not wet, the lower critical temperature is about 32 degrees. And below that temperature is when energy needs start to increase. And you can see in the table here, for every degree that the wind chill is below 1%, is below 32 degrees, there's a 1% increase in energy needs. But then if we have cold and wet conditions like we've had recently and we're even having now, that lower critical temperature is much higher, meaning it doesn't have to get as cold if they have a wet hair coat for them to need a lot more energy. And so we're going to work through an example of what this looks like from a practical feeding standpoint. So in this example, the wind chill is 22 degrees. And if we're just having a cold day, but there's not moisture, the cattle's hair coat is not wet, they're not standing in snow or rain, then we're going to use that lower critical temperature of 32 degrees. And so if we take the difference of 32 and 22 degrees, which is the current wind chill in this example, we have a difference of 10, and we multiply that by the 1% for every degree difference, then we need 10% greater energy in this diet for this cow at that 22 degree wind chill. And so in practical feeding terms, that's almost 2 pounds of TDN at peak lactation. So if you think back to that 18 pounds that I mentioned earlier, we're going to add an additional 2 pounds of that. So we're now feeding that cow 20 pounds of energy a day to keep up with her energy needs. But if we have cold and wet weather, or the cow has a wet hair coat, then we're going to subtract that 22 degree wind chill from 59 degrees. And so here we have a 37 degree difference. We multiply that by 2% because it's basically compounded by the cold and the wet. And so we have a 74% greater energy need in this case. And that equates to over 13 pounds of TDN additional. So we've added, on top of the 18 pounds we're already feeding her just to meet her energy needs for lactation, we also have to feed her 13 more pounds to meet her needs that are compromised by this cold, wet weather. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about, especially getting cows through this month when it's really wet and cold, how much we actually have to feed them to keep up with that so that they don't lose body condition. So in addition to just the climatic conditions, muddy conditions can also start to limit intake in cattle and start to decrease their body condition if they, stay off feed for too long. So of course, and some of Matt's work is really interesting on the fence line feeders. And so you all know and are familiar with the feeding issues that mud can create, having to get out in the pasture and drive the tractor and deliver hay bales. And so not only are there some practical feeding issues when it comes to mud, but it also creates a suction on the legs and the hooves of cattle. And so this makes it more challenging for them to walk. They're less motivated to have to trudge through that mud and get to the feeder. And so they may start to back off some of that hay or feed just because they don't want to utilize the energy to get there. So 4 to 8 inches of mud can decrease intake by 4 to 8%. And if we think about, the muddy conditions that we've had for several months now, that can really be a tremendous factor in limiting intake if we don't keep an eye on those hay feeding areas. So when we provide energy to a cow, her body prioritizes or partitions energy for different uses. And so she basically has to meet these requirements before she meets the next one. It's kind of like a checkpoint. So she'll meet her maintenance requirements first, and then if she's lactating, she'll of course provide milk for that calf, or her body will. But only after that will she put any energy towards growth. And then after that, energy towards her existing pregnancy. And then once that is met, she will start to cycle and establish a new pregnancy. So these are kind of the tiers of the way the energy is utilized by a cow. And so it's really important when we're getting ready to breed back cows that we're allowing them to maintain a body condition that's going to make that rebreeding successful so that we can maintain that calving interval. and have a calf on the ground from her every year. And so basically, she's going to make sure that her body and her energy stores are taken care of first before she establishes another pregnancy. And that's why it's really important to maintain body condition leading up to calving and then after calving. And so this is some information about body condition score that probably you've seen before. I really like this table. It presents the body condition score at calving and how it affects the postpartum interval, or the amount of time that it takes her to resume a normal estrus cycle, which means the amount of time that it takes, or equates to the amount of time that it takes for her to breed back. And so if we have cows that are calving in these lower body conditions, 3 and 4, then they're not going to come back into estrus or into heat for 70 or 80 days. And we really want to get her rebred in about 60 days to try to maintain that calving interval. And so if we manage her body condition in a higher range, 5 or 6, then we're going to keep that postpartum interval shorter, and we're going to be able to maintain that calving interval more appropriately. So the nutrition aspect of not only the third trimester, but also after calving is really important to be able to maintain that tight calving season. So again, I'm coming at y'all with the visuals. I really like these comparisons. And so this top one is a fall calving calendar, and we can see how body condition changes throughout that season. And then the bottom is spring calving. And so when we think about fall calving, we're calving in October. She's, hopefully calving at a body condition score of 6. And once she calves, we expect her to drop some body condition throughout the lactation and breeding. And then because she's probably roughed it through the winter on some, moderate quality hay and some supplement, at turnout, she may have dropped 2 body condition scores. And so at turnout, she may be a 4. And we can rely on some of that, green grass to really pick back up her body condition. But a lot of times, lush forage, even though it's high in protein and energy, a lot of it is water, right? So she's really going to have to eat a lot of that lush forage to get that nutrition and energy reserves back up. And so if we're doing a good job over here maintaining that body condition score high enough before calving, we're not going to get into a situation here where maybe she's dropped down to even a 3, and it's going to be harder to get her back up to that 5 or 6 where we want her. And then when we think about spring calving, we don't see that much of, that big of an issue compared to fall calving, because we're able to wean and calve in the months that we're providing some hay and supplement, but then we can put them onto that lush growing forage a little bit earlier, and so they're not going through as stressful of an event, to keep that body condition score up. I wanted to mention briefly fetal programming. This is not something that I am very well versed in, so I'm going to keep it pretty base level here. But it's important to remember that cow nutrition affects pregnancy establishment. So their body condition score at calving and rebreeding will affect how well they breed back, but it also can affect their subsequent calf performance. And so there's some research that shows that if you provide a supplement during late gestation, and that's typically a protein supplement, there may not be a huge effect on birth weight, but there could be an increase in weaning body weight, feed efficiency, weaning rates, potentially less morbidity and mortality in calves. And so this is just something, again, to keep in mind, making sure that even if this cow is dry, leading up to calving, we want to still provide plenty of nutrition to her so that we don't negatively affect her calf's performance as it starts to grow after it's born. So just to put some numbers with that, and again, I'm not very well versed in this, but I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's something that I'd be interested in learning more about or doing some work with. These were 2 studies that provided either a supplement during the last trimester of gestation or no supplement. And there were some differences. There were some that were significant and some that weren't. Um, but they saw a greater adjusted 205-day weight, potentially uh, a difference in age at puberty, so specifically in this Funston study, a younger age at puberty, and then a difference in pregnancy rates of heifers that were born to the cows who received supplement during their late gestation. So not only are we, worried about getting that cow rebred, but we want to think about how we're affecting her calf down the road and how it performs during that late gestation period. So I know that these meetings focused or wanted to focus on spring management considerations. So I wanted to kind of build up to this spring calving grazing considerations since we've kind of already moved through that fall and winter period. Maybe you're getting ready or have just started calving for your spring calving season. And so I think the good thing to remember is that green up is just around the corner. And so we're hopefully going to have some sunnier and warmer days ahead once we get through this flooding that's going to be happening this weekend here in Tennessee. But we want to make sure that we're not grazing too early. So I want to talk about kind of utilizing the resources that maybe we have right now, and then thinking about how to graze forages as they green up. So if you have stockpile or hay, make sure that you're utilizing those efficiently. And then if you have cool season annuals, you may choose to limit graze those rather than just turning cattle out onto those fully. And so I want to kind of talk about what that looks like. When we talk about using a stockpile forage efficiently, specifically in the case of tall fescue, that frontal grazing method really works well for tall fescue. And that's because we can allocate a strip of forage to those cows at a time, and then we can move that fence maybe every few days to allocate some more. And we don't necessarily have to have a back fence in this situation because fescue is not actively growing during the time that we're grazing stockpile. This allows us to, let them have access to water if we don't have water that we can move along the paddock. And then you may even consider putting some hay out with that stockpile. And so they may be eating a portion of their diet as hay, and a portion of their dry matter intake may be coming from stockpiled fescue. And so that's one way to kind of stretch that resource out a little bit. You're not maybe utilizing as much hay as you would if you were specifically, or if you were only depending on that hay, but it allows you to kind of stretch the number of days that you're grazing your stockpile. And then limit grazing, when we think about cool season annuals, if you have access to cool season annuals, if you've planted those, you can limit graze them. So you allow cattle access for just a few hours a day or maybe a couple days a week, and this can decrease hay needs as well. So in a limit grazing situation, you may have cattle, they may be on a dry lot or they may be on stockpile fescue, and then you may let them go into this cool season annual area for, like I said, maybe a day, maybe a couple hours, utilizing, again, strip grazing. Allow them to come in here and use it as a supplement. So instead of feeding a commodity product as a supplement, utilizing this really high quality forage, but kind of diluting it with hay or stockpile forage as well. And so this works well during this time of year. And I just wanted to share a little bit of data from Arkansas where they compared feeding corn gluten feed 3 times a week to limit grazing either 2 times a week or 3 times a week for 7 hours a day. And so this kind of demonstrates using either grazing or commodity feeds as a supplemental feed source. And just to show you that this doesn't really take a lot of land to accomplish, they had 30 cows, and so they stocked at 0.1 or 1/10 of an acre per cow per day because they're not going to be on there very long, right? So we can use a pretty heavy stocking density. And so for each grazing event, they used 3 acres. They grazed it 2 days a week, which means a total of 6 acres needed for that week. And then they came back every 2 weeks, so they allowed those paddocks to rest. So they used a total of 12 acres here. So just, demonstrating that you don't have to utilize a great deal of winter annuals. You don't have to convert your whole farm to winter annuals, but just using them as a supplemental feed source is an option on a small amount of land. And so what they found in this study that the cows that limit grazed the winter annuals maintained a similar body condition score to those that were fed that concentrate-based supplement. They all maintain a body condition score of 5 or greater. And from a practical standpoint, that's where we want them to fall. And they didn't find a difference between 2 or 3 days of grazing per week. And so I think that this is a really neat option to utilize graze forages and still meet some of those higher energy and protein needs without having to supplement maybe a commodity feed. Some more grazing considerations for spring calving, making sure that you're waiting for fescue to be plentiful before you turn out. So it'll be real tempting when that fescue starts to green up to put cows on it and allow them to use that so that you don't have to maybe feed as much of those stored forages. But we don't want cows chasing green grass. And so I put that in quotes because they're going to find high quality forage and they're going to, go out of their way if they can to graze that. And so not only do we not want them spending a lot of energy going out and trying to find the best forage, but we also want to make sure that we give that fescue a chance to get up tall enough so that when we do put cattle on it, there's plenty for them and there's plenty to be able to regrow later. And then finally, just driving home that point that cattle need to maintain a 5 or 6 body condition score up until breeding. So if they have dropped in body condition throughout the winter, again, those spring forages right at the beginning may not be enough to meet those high demands that they have because they're pretty full of water, and so we want to make sure that even though it's out there, they're still able to get enough energy to maintain that body condition or even improve it if they've dropped some body condition throughout the winter. Real quick, I want to mention grass tetany. Like I said, I know Dr. Bates talked about this briefly on Wednesday. And so just to follow up on that, grass tetany is known as grass staggers sometimes or hypomagnesemia, which means there's low levels of magnesium in the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid. And so really the cause of it is pretty complex. You can't really nail down one cause. It's kind of a combination of factors of maybe low magnesium in the diet or certain mineral imbalances in the diet that start to affect how magnesium is taken up in the body. And then, of course, high levels of milk production seem to pull some of that magnesium out of the system as well. So the reason that we think about it right now, this time of year, is because most often we see it in animals that are either grazing fast-growing, cool season forages or those that are in early lactation. And so if we have spring calvers and they're, getting ready to calve and then go on to lush, fast-growing forages, there is a high risk of grass tetany occurring. And so it's important to remember that preventing this is going to be the best way rather than waiting to treat it. So I have a quote here: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Making sure that you're staying on top of that and feeding a high mag mineral this time of year is going to be a really good insurance policy. Of course, there can be some magnesium that comes from feed sources or forages, but for just a couple of months out of the year, it would make me feel better and probably a lot of cattle producers feel better just to go ahead and provide all of that magnesium from a mineral source. And so typically these minerals will be a 10 to 14% magnesium, and they should be consumed at a rate to provide 0.6 ounces of magnesium per day. And so there's a really good mineral publication that UT Extension has put out a couple of years ago that goes into this a little bit deeper, that you can find some recommendations on feeding high mag mineral. It is important to remember that cattle don't use their stored magnesium very efficiently, so it may be stored in their bones or in their body, but they're not going to be able to pull from those stores as easily. So making sure that that mineral is provided every day and plenty of it is provided every day to keep those magnesium levels high enough in their body throughout this time of year. So that really hits on the topics I wanted to focus on. I'll take any questions, or I'd be interested to hear if there are any common questions that you all get this time of year that I can, help you all address.
But if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. And there is one that was put in a little earlier, Katie, that asks, what's the best way to provide energy for grass-fed cattle?
Yeah, so energy for grass-fed cattle. So when we think about supplementation on grass systems, the biggest thing that I think it's important to realize is they utilize starchy feeds and forage or fibrous-based feeds differently. And so we want to provide an energy source that more closely matches that fiber-based energy. And some of the common commodity feeds, at least here, that we can use are soy hulls and then corn gluten feed. Those seem to work well on a forage or grass-fed diet. And then I guess specifically thinking, and I may have misunderstood your question, but now that I'm saying it out loud, if you're only grass feeding cattle, making sure that you're finding the highest energy hay that you can, because they're going to have to take in a lot of that forage to meet their energy needs. If you have access to something really high quality like alfalfa, or even just, fescue and orchard grass that has been managed well and cut at a time that it's going to be high quality hay, whatever you can find that is the most energy dense is going to be important, just so that they can take in enough of that forage to meet their energy needs.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Is there anybody else has or want to ask?
Hey, Katie, I have a comment to make. This is Matt Webb. I noticed that there was a couple of sheep guys that was on today, so I just want to mention that some of the data that you presented on the limit grazing, I didn't intend to do this winter, but with my little sheep flock, we ended up doing a combination of limit grazing and strips. And since we are been working from home periodically, I've been able to do that limit grazing this year with the sheep. So they get to go out for a few hours and then they come and they're locked back up here in the barn lot with hay, and I got all mine are lactating, so they are getting some grain right now. But my normal hay use for my 14 or 15 ewes that I normally lamb out is usually about 6 round bales. And as of today, I have 2 round bales left, and we're going to be at the 1st of March here in just a few days. So, for those of you that are sheep guys, that limit grazing method really works well for those as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad that you brought that up. And I don't know as much about small ruminant nutrition. I've gotten several small ruminant questions. So yeah, some of these grazing systems can translate pretty well to small ruminants. So I'm glad to hear you're doing that, Matt.
Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. So any final questions?